Hello and welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Azam Khan. The president of the European Council, Charles Michel, visited China to meet President Xi earlier this month. As the global economy becomes split into US-China camps, with regional cooperation enhancing, the EU is figuring out how to play the balancing act. On the one hand, trying to diversify its economic reliance on China, and on the other, protect its own business interests from sweeping US policies, like the recent climate law. How can China-EU relations best be optimized going forward to achieve a multipolar world? My guest today is Fabio Massimo Parenti, Associate Professor at China Foreign Affairs University, who specializes in geopolitics and international studies. Mr. Parenti, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you for your invitation. Thank you so much.
The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz first visited China before Charles Michel did, and he publicly recently cautioned that the West should avoid Cold War rhetoric and a Cold War-style approach toward China. So would you say that means his visit was an eventful one?
Well, to a certain extent, it can be considered an important turning point for Europe to reapproach consistently China. We don't know if and how it will happen because European Union follows so much United States political agenda, and this has been consistently detrimental to European interest. However, Europe cannot survive without China, cannot survive without a greater integration in Eurasia. And so here the dilemma between the ideological posture, the subordination to United States interest, and our material interest to be much more integrated.
Right. So what are your thoughts between the sort of split sentiment that is happening right now within EU leadership? On the one hand, you have the likes of Scholz, who seems to be doing a continuation of Angela Merkel's policies of pragmatism toward China. And on the other, there's some growing rhetoric of anti-China stance from other pockets of the EU. So how does Europe play that balance?
It is, as I said, a dilemma because, first of all, at the macro level, surely Europe, European Union, namely, and China are two fundamental global economy poles and political poles needed to rebalance the current fractures and the US unilateralism at a certain extent. However, we are still living in the recent years this consistent, significant idiosyncrasy between ideology on one hand, that means a value-oriented policy toward China, and material interest. So also during the recent visits by Scholz and Charles Michel, actually, we asked and we pray at a certain extent China to intervene with its own influence towards Russia to solve the Ukraine-Russian conflict that obviously is particularly impacting in Europe. But at the same time, we still keep an ideological approach. I mean, our sanctions towards China on different issues and pretexts such as Xinjiang criticism and problems are considered right, just sanctions, legal sanctions with good reasons. If China put its own counter-sanctions, they are considered in a negative sense, under a negative light. So there is not a peer relationship. I mean, the main deficit in the European approach is avoiding to be reciprocal in terms of mutual respect. Beyond differences, we need mutual respect in order to fulfill material interest and to better understand each other. European Union asked China to do something that is in the responsibility of European Union. I mean, on the Ukraine-Russian conflict, the European Union should define its own strategy autonomously. And this is not happening at all. This is suggested by China. China cannot intervene in that conflict if Europe doesn't identify itself as a neutral part in the conflict.
Michel and President Xi both reiterated when he came to China that there needs to be a de-escalation in the conflict in Ukraine. So they came to that mutual understanding, and it didn't seem like they were pushing China to do more, whether it's the unilateral sanctions that the U.S. aggressively pushes. So would you say that's a good sign of Europe showing some sovereignty, as you were mentioning, in this whole conflict, and not just being, voicing the American voice?
Of course, we know very well that Germany, France, Italy, Eastern European countries are consistently linked to China. So, as you say, Scholz is trying to retake under control the heritage of Merkel pragmatic approach. Because our interests are really consistent in terms of investment flows, in terms of trade, are the most important volume of trade exchange at the world level. China has become recently the first trade partner of the entire European Union. The volume reached almost 700 billions per year. And also during the pandemic, the exchange with China was particularly important for European resilience. So, yes, of course, Europe would like to have an autonomous standpoint and posture toward China, but geopolitically and militarily speaking, we are often under threat by United States radical presence in our society as an historical heritage after the Second World War. So, as I say, there is a very contradictory environment where many business people, firms, and economic interests are pushing our governments to have a pragmatic approach with China. On the other hand, the excuse of a value-oriented, very hypocritical, very often value-oriented approach is still a way to have a self-referential approach.
Yeah, yes, control the narrative. Yeah.
Exactly.
But then, speaking on the U.S.'s influence over Europe, over EU, would you say that it's losing its influence when you have Macron recently stating that that Europe should take its own stance towards China and not necessarily have it be an aggressive one? And when the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said the same thing, are these signs that the Europe is slowly gaining its own sovereignty with regards to China?
Of course, we have some positive movement in this sense, because obviously European Union has no interest to the link from United States. But surely the problem is the excessive influence from United States. This is not easy to solve this issue, because, for example, let me make the example of our new premier in Italy. I was surprised to see an open and pragmatic approach in Bali during the G20 summit by Giorgia Meloni. this is a positive, is in line with Spain, French and German new declaration statements, because we need China, we need relation with China, good relation with China. The main problem is that following the Trump administration approach, following the Biden's approach that is also more radical toward China, we are creating new problems in our relation with China. Let me remind you and our audience, the comprehensive agreement on investment that was blocked on not practical basis, because actually that agreement in 2020 was the result of long-term negotiation, was the result of new legislative environment evolution in China in order to protect property rights, in order to improve labor law, and so on. So actually, we already reached a greater agreement and consensus between both sides. But this agreement has been always blocked by strong interferences in the European Parliament, namely, that has this how can I say, this transversal approach related to always talking about Hong Kong, Xinjiang, the internal affairs of China, and very often in an ideological way, where very often starting from reports elaborated in a very, how can I say, superficial way by think tanks, Australian think tanks, London think tanks, Washington think tanks, and so on. So we suffer this strong interference much more from United States. There are positive signs, you say, but we have to see if we are able to plan longer relationship, new projects, and keep alive the positive steps that we have done until now.
I need to pause you right there, Professor, while we take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. After the break, we'll be back with Professor Fabio Parenti. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Talk the Walk. I'm speaking with Associate Professor Fabio Parenti on Sino-European relations. Professor, you mentioned the Italian Prime Minister, the new Italian leader earlier. So I wanted to get more information about the Chinese-Italian relationship and where that could go. Obviously, like you mentioned, they met on the sidelines of the G20, and China's a very important partnership to Italy, whether it's in tourism or during the aid. It was shown also during the pandemic when China helped Italy a lot with aid and supplies. So how do you see this? How do you see that Sino-Italian relationship evolving going forward?
Okay, first of all, we have to remember that China and Italy has a very long tradition of exchange, not only nowadays in modern contemporary time, but also in ancient time. For example, we established in the 17th century the first Chinese school in Europe, in Naples. Nowadays it is a university, l'Orientale di Napoli. And so there are many links, also culturally speaking, the centrality of family, a family-driven society, for example, and many other links and interest in common in, as you mentioned, in the tourist sectors, but also in other sectors. So cultural tourism are surely key points in our cooperation. We advance our relationship with China recently after signing the Memorandum of Understanding in 2019 with a very open-minded approach towards China. And this was really positive, accelerated further our relationship and the positive gains, mutual gains. However, there has been a discontinuity with the Draghi's government before Meloni, before the recent one. Mario Draghi's government was a real a sign, negative sign in our relationship, bilateral relationship, because actually my interpretation is the following. Draghi was called by European partners plus the consensus and support of United States to readdress Italian foreign policies. That was the experience under the Draghi's government. I'm talking about according to empirical evidences. Every project between China and Italy during the Draghi's government, little bit more than 1 year, was blocked. From the book presentation to the wind park in the south of Italy, that was a big project still in place, but blocked in its expansion and evolution. We have different stages of that project in Taranto. It was an offshore wind park. And then with the involvement of Chinese investment as well. And many other projects, also joint university. We have a project to open a private university, Sino-Italian private university in the south of Italy that was blocked by a legal act or just blocked, marginalizing lots of events and projects. So this was really detrimental and negative. Nowadays, Giorgia Meloni is reopening doors toward China. I was particularly surprised about it, but actually we still don't have practical and material element.
It's still early days for that. She obviously met President Xi at the sidelines and seemed quite happy about that experience, so it could have been caught up in the moment and showing the rhetoric of that. But
exactly.
Were you surprised, because normally when it's a nationalist government, which runs on that sort of campaign, that they tend to take a more, like some of the Eastern European countries have taken a much more stronger stance against, in rhetoric against China. Is it because of that particular reason, that's usually the trend of these European countries?
I don't think it's necessarily because of the nationalist point of view, because actually a real authentic nationalist point of view will accelerate in the relation with China. Because it's in our interest. Obviously, you have to be wise and clever enough in order to balance according to your own interest. And here we are talking about a rhetoric nationalism, a form of populism.
Right.
Yes, very weak, that use the rhetoric of national identity, but actually they are also subordinated to great power influence, above all under our main chief in place in Europe, that is United States, as we have said.
Professor, I want to shift the focus to Eurasia, and you mentioned the historical significance of Italy and China's relationship, and that's something China appreciates as well, which is what it's trying to do in when it comes to the One Belt, One Road, and re-emerging the significance along in Eurasia. And Xi Jinping places a lot of importance to that region. It was his first state visit after many years when he went to Kazakhstan. So how can the Chinese Eurasian development and relationship, as that continues to grow, how can that affect and impact the relationship between Europe and China?
Okay, I see these relations within also these relations within a long-term approach. I mean, structurally speaking, the Eurasian continent is increasing the level of interdependency. This is a matter of fact. China is the main driver in this integration process. And this macro transformation has already changed the balance of power between world regions and is still downsizing the ability of the United States to keep control and influence everywhere in the world. The main recent sign about this process, long-term tendency, could be seen during the Samarkand summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in September, but also during the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Platform and during the G20 and many other meetings that are constantly happening in the Asian continent. The world has radically changed. China is the driver, and this is a matter of fact, it is not a point of view. And this is the reason why United States and UK system are trying to exploit the Ukraine space and the Ukraine crisis as a way to still trying to contain the Eurasian integration. This is the reason why, on the other hand, the West is much more isolated nowadays than the rest of the world, because the majority of world population, even though they can see with different interpretation the Russian-Ukraine situation, nobody is turning her back to Russia. And why? Because everybody, the majority of world population, including China, are still building alternative system of payment, of trade, of investment, of regulation of integration process, alternative to the Western system. Why? Not because they want to wage war against the West. It is not in the interest of the majority of world population. It's not in the interest in the plan of China, Russia, or India or Iran. The problem is surviving. The problem is bypassing the systematic process of exploiting hegemonic status. I mean, every countries in Latin America and Africa and Asia underwent different forms of pressures, interference, foreign war by NATO, debt trap and financial trap established through the weaponization of the dollar centrality in the world. So you have just to see the system of sanctions put in place by the Western countries. In the recent years, we completely violated constantly the WTO rules and all the so-called liberal system based on rules have been subverted in the recent years prevalently by its own promoter and by the father of this system. This is why Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS Plus countries are exploding in terms of
that's right. The influence and the growth is exploding. Absolutely, that's true. Professor, I'm sorry, I believe that's all the time we have. Fabio Parenti, thank you so much for taking the time, though, to speak with me.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you the same time next week. Goodbye.